She pushed through the collapsed tunnel and found a cavern glowing with lantern light. The morning mist clung to the Appalachian hollow like a living thing, rolling between the skeletal branches of winter bare oaks and the dense green of the evergreens that had survived the hard season. Margaret, a young girl with dark hair perpetually escaping its braid and a face perpetually smudged with the dust of daily living in the remote mountains, stood at the edge of her family's property with her boots planted firmly in the rust-colored soil. Her dress, once a serviceable brown cloth, was faded and patched at the hem where she'd caught it on branches during her last expedition to the ridgeline. Her fingers were calloused, her nails rimmed with dirt, her eyes bright with the kind of curiosity that made her mama shake her head and mutter about wild spirits and willful children. But Margaret didn't concern herself much with what her mama thought about her wanderings. The mountains had always called to her in a way that the domestic tasks of cooking and mending never could. And on this particular morning in March, with the snow beginning to melt and water running swift and loud through the hollows, she felt that call more strongly than ever. The sound drew her forward, that eternal rushing of water that never ceased in these mountains, even in the driest seasons. She picked her way through the underbrush with the practiced silence of someone who had spent more time in the forest than in civilization, on her worn leather boots finding purchase on the steep banks, with barely a disturbed pebble. The creek ran high with snowmelt, churning brown and frothy where it hit the rocks, and she followed it upward, toward the sound that had been nagging at her for the past week. During the heavy rains, the roar had been unmistakable, but now that the worst had passed, she could hear something beneath it, a different quality to the falling water, almost like it was falling from a greater height than it should. Her breathing quickened. She had explored nearly every inch of the accessible parts of the hollow, had climbed the ridge to the north, had ventured into the dark pines to the east, had waded across the creek at a dozen different points. But she had never followed the water this far up toward its source. The path grew more difficult, the banks steeper, the rocks slicker with spray and moss. She had to crouch low, moving forward with her hands nearly touching the ground, her skirt catching on branches, mud coating her legs up to the knee. And then the canyon widened. The trees fell away. The roar of water became deafening. She straightened up slowly, her heart hammering in her chest, and stepped out into a space that made her feel suddenly very small. The waterfall was not large by any standard she could imagine, perhaps 30 feet high, but it fell into a pool of startling clarity. The water so transparent that she could see every stone on the bottom. The cliff face behind the falling water rose up in tiers of gray stone, ancient and weathered. And it was this cliff face that held her attention. Because there, hidden partially behind the cascade of water and overhung with a tangle of winter-killed vines, was an opening. An opening that looked, unmistakably, like it had once been a tunnel entrance. The rocks around it were arranged too deliberately to be the work of erosion alone, their edges squared off and fitted together with a precision that spoke of hands that knew their craft. But a massive collapse of stone had partially sealed it, leaving only a ragged gap perhaps 2 feet wide at its widest point, the opening jagged with broken rock and promising nothing but darkness and danger beyond. Margaret stood for a long moment, staring at the gap, her mind racing with possibilities. Her grandmother had spoken once of the old travelers, the ones who had come through the mountains long ago, before settlements, when the ridges and hollows were untamed. There were stories, half remembered and dismissed as legend, of hidden places built by people long gone, shelters carved into the stone itself. Her mouth went dry. She had to see. Of course she had to see. Her mama would forbid it instantly if she knew, which meant Margaret would tell no one until she had answers. She scrambled down the bank to the pool's edge, her boots finding precarious holds on the wet stone, and approached the waterfall from the side, using the veil of water as shelter from the wind that had begun to pick up. The spray soaked her dress immediately, plastering it to her legs, but she barely noticed. Her eyes were fixed on that opening in the stone. Up close, the damage was even more evident. The collapse had been violent, Chica scattering boulders across the ground before the entrance and creating a chaotic tumble of broken rock. But the opening still existed, and as she studied it, she realized it might be just barely wide enough for a thin, determined child to squeeze through. Margaret had always been small for her age, her growth slow and her frame narrow. The realization sent a thrill through her that was part fear and part exhilaration. She could do this. She could get through. She approached the gap cautiously, testing the rocks to make sure they were stable, pulling herself up onto the rough stone and peering into the darkness beyond. The air that drifted out of the tunnel was cool and carried scents she couldn't immediately identify, something mineral and ancient, and underneath that, something else. Something that might have been smoke or lamp oil or something else entirely. The darkness was absolute, a wall of black that her eyes couldn't penetrate no matter how hard she stared. She took a breath, held it, and began to squeeze herself into the gap. The stone scraped against her ribs, caught at her dress, pulled at her braid. Sharp edges bit into her palms as she pulled herself forward, inch by inch, into that consuming darkness. Her heart was racing so fast, she thought it might explode from her chest. This was foolish. This was dangerous. This was absolutely, without question, exactly what she needed to do. The tunnel seemed impossibly long as she crawled through it, though it was probably no more than a dozen feet of absolute darkness before her fingers found smooth stone ahead, the passage opening up. And she pulled herself through the gap and tumbled forward onto her hands and knees in a space that was no longer confined. She lay there for a moment, breathing hard, her eyes still useless in the darkness, and then she became aware of something extraordinary. The darkness was not complete. There was light, faint, warm, golden light, filtering through the darkness from somewhere ahead. Her eyes adjusted gradually, and as they did, the spaces around her began to resolve into shape and shadow. A passage, a vast passage, high enough that she could stand upright. And she did, unfolding her legs carefully, her hands still instinctively reaching out to feel the stone around her. The walls curved slightly inward, shaped by hands, smoothed by the passage of time and weather. And ahead, where the passage opened into what must be a larger space, that golden light was growing stronger. Margaret moved toward it like a person in a dream, her wet dress clinging to her skin, her fear now sublimated into a kind of awed wonder. The passage opened abruptly into a cavern that stole her breath. It was enormous. The ceiling soared up into shadow, so high that she couldn't quite make out its shape. But her sense of space told her it was vast, a cathedral carved from the living stone of the mountain. And it was lit. That golden light came from lanterns, oil lanterns, she realized, at least a dozen of them spaced around the cavern walls, burning with a steady flame that couldn't have been lit long ago. The light they cast was warm and wavering, creating a landscape of shadow and illumination that was both welcoming and deeply unsettling. Because this cavern was not empty. It was occupied, filled, stacked with the evidence of human habitation and careful planning. Hanging from the ceiling on iron hooks that had been driven deep into the stone were braids of garlic and onions, dozens of them, their papery skins catching the lamplight. Below them, from wooden racks that had been built into the cavern walls, hung strips of smoked meat, the jerky dark and aged and preserved. Against the far wall, lined up in rows with the precision of a well-stocked larder, were hundreds of glass jars. She could see them glinting in the lamplight, their contents preserved in various shades of gold and amber and deep ruby red. Peaches, she realized. Those golden ones were peaches, preserved in what must be sugar and spices. The red ones were berries, and there were jars of vegetables she couldn't immediately identify, on the colors indicating different preparations and preservation methods. Sacks of grain were piled in the corner near what appeared to be a stone hearth, built into the cavern wall with a chimney hole leading upward into the darkness above. Barrels lined the base of the wall, and when she moved closer, she could read markings on them, hastily made but still visible. Water, salt, something else that had faded with time. There were wooden crates, some still closed and sealed, others opened to reveal tools, hammers and axes and saws, all well maintained, oiled to prevent rust. There were pallets made of straw and rough blankets, arranged around the hearth as if waiting for people to return to them at any moment. There were books, she saw with a shock that sent another thrill through her. Books stacked on a wooden shelf built into the wall. Actual books, their leather covers dark with age. There were medicines arrayed on another shelf, bottles and tins and bundles of dried herbs hanging from nails. Everything spoke of preparation, of planning, of survival. Margaret moved through the cavern slowly, her fear completely gone now, replaced by a kind of reverent wonder. Someone had built this. Someone had spent enormous effort and care creating this refuge, and then had maintained it meticulously year after year. The lanterns alone suggested recent use, that oil wouldn't last forever. Someone had been here recently. Someone might return at any moment. The thought sent a small frisson of fear up her spine, but she pushed it away. Whoever had built this place, whoever maintained it, they had done so in secret, in hiding. They would not appreciate being discovered, but they were not here now. The cavern was silent except for a faint sound of water, running somewhere deep in the earth, a sound like the beating of a subterranean heart. She ventured deeper into the cavern, past the main chamber, and found herself in a narrower passage that twisted deeper into the mountain. Her courage faltered slightly here, but her curiosity was stronger. The passage opened into a second cavern, smaller than the first, but just as carefully prepared. Here there were sleeping quarters proper, with bed frames built from timber and carefully arranged. A desk, incredibly, carved from what must be a salvaged piece of wood and covered in papers. She moved toward it, drawn by the mystery of what secrets it might contain. The papers were mostly records, she realized, lists of supplies taken and dates added, to inventories carefully maintained. Drawings, she recognized one as a map of the cavern system, showing the passage she had entered through and others, deeper routes that presumably led further into the mountain. And then, buried beneath the papers, a journal of some kind. The leather was cracked with age, the pages yellowed, but the writing inside was neat and careful. Margaret opened it carefully, afraid that it might fall to pieces, and read the first entry, dated in a hand that was precise but slightly wavering. March of 1792. The hideaway is complete. We have preserved enough to last us 3 winters, if necessary. God willing, we will never need to stay long, But the time is coming when a refugee may be needed. When the laws change, when men decide that our beliefs and our very lives are contraband, we will have this place. Built in secret, known only to those who can be trusted. May God protect us. Margaret's breath caught. This was not simply a shelter. This was a sanctuary, built in secret, maintained in secret, waiting. She turned the pages carefully, reading entry after entry spanning years. The handwriting changed occasionally, suggesting that multiple people had maintained these records. Later entries spoke of people coming and going, of families hiding here briefly before moving on to somewhere else, of the constant vigilance required to keep the location secret, of supplies being added and replenished. One entry from 1807 read, "Thomas and his family arrived 3 days ago. The youngest child was fevered, but the medicines worked. They stayed only a week before moving on to the settlement in the north. That is the 5th group we have helped this year. The work continues, even as the danger increases. We are careful. We will always be careful." Margaret carefully closed the journal and replaced it beneath the papers. She understood, even in her 11-year-old way, that she had stumbled upon something that was not hers to fully comprehend, something that had meaning beyond her immediate understanding, but something that was profoundly important. Someone, a community, she realized, had built this place as a refuge for people in danger, and they had maintained it carefully across years and decades. The lanterns that burned in the outer cavern were kept lit as a beacon. The supplies were kept fresh. It was waiting. Always waiting for the next person who needed shelter, the next family who needed safety. She spent hours in the cavern, exploring every corner she dared, careful not to disturb anything, touching the supplies only briefly, running her fingers along the smooth stone of the walls. She read parts of other journals she found, books from the shelf, documents that spoke of a hidden network of safe places, people helping other people across many miles, a chain of compassion that had existed long before she was born and would likely continue long after she was gone. When the light filtering through the tunnel entrance began to dim, indicating that afternoon was turning toward evening, she reluctantly made her way back toward the entrance. But not before she went to the jars of preserved peaches, selected one of the most beautiful, a perfect specimen with fruit suspended in syrup the color of honey, and carefully wrapped it in cloth from one of the supply stores. Evidence. Proof. Something to explain where she had been and what she had discovered, if anyone asked. Though she knew, instinctively, that she would tell no one. Not yet. Not until she understood more. The crawl back through the tunnel was harder than the way in, her muscles tired now, her wet clothes clinging to her skin. But she dragged herself through, feet first this time, letting gravity help her. She emerged behind the waterfall into the fading light of early evening, soaking wet and muddy and exhausted, and the jar of preserved peaches cradled carefully against her chest. The walk home was long, and the questions she would have to answer would be difficult. Where had she been? Why was she so wet? Why was she so muddy? But Margaret walked through the darkening forest, with a secret tucked into her chest that was deeper and larger than any of her usual explorations, and her eyes were bright with the knowledge of what she had found. There was a hidden world beneath the mountain. There was a network of people working in secret, helping others survive, hiding them, feeding them, keeping them safe. And she had been chosen somehow to stumble upon their greatest treasure, to see what they had built and to understand something about sacrifice and community and the lengths that good people would go to protect others from harm. She emerged from the forest a quarter mile from her house just as full darkness was settling over the hollow. Her mama was waiting on the porch, anxiety carved into every line of her face, ready to scold and question and worry. But Margaret held out the jar of preserved peaches, let the last light of the dying day catch the golden syrup inside, and said simply, "I found something." The mystery of what she had discovered would haunt the hollow for years to come, whispered about but never fully solved. The proof of that hidden place beneath the mountain locked in the heart of a young girl who had learned that there was so much more to her world than she had ever imagined, and that the greatest gifts we can give each other are sanctuary and hope and a safe place to rest when the world becomes too cruel to bear. The cavern waited in the darkness below, lanterns still burning, supplies still carefully maintained, a beacon and a shelter, and a promise that good people would continue their secret work, generation after generation, long into the future that Margaret could not yet see, but would come to understand. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she held the oil lantern she had carefully taken from its hook in the first cavern, grateful that the light it cast was warm enough that the loss of one lantern would not be immediately obvious to anyone who might return. The flame danced within the glass, casting her shadow long and distorted across the cavern walls as she ventured deeper into the passages that the map on the desk had suggested led further into the mountain's heart. The stone beneath her feet was worn smooth by countless footsteps, generations of careful passage through these hidden ways, and she could not help but think about all the people who had walked this same path, all the souls who had sought refuge in these depths, each running from something in the world above that had become too dangerous to bear. The passage narrowed and widened in unpredictable patterns, carved not by the patient work of water, but by human hands with tools, shaped to allow passage while concealing the tunnels from any casual observer. The air grew cooler as she descended, and with it came new scents, mineral and ancient, and underneath that the unmistakable smell of preserved food, more concentrated and pungent than in the main cavern. Her curiosity pulled her forward, even as a small voice in the back of her mind whispered about the foolishness of a young girl wandering alone in the depths of a mountain where no one knew she was, where no one could hear her if she called for help. But Margaret had never been good at listening to that small voice. The passage opened suddenly into a cavern even larger than the first, and what she saw stopped her in her tracks, her mouth falling open in wonder. The cavern was lined, floor to ceiling, with glass jars, hundreds of them, thousands perhaps. They stood on wooden shelves that had been built with meticulous care, tier upon tier rising up into the shadows where her lantern light could not quite reach. The jars caught her lamplight and threw it back at her, creating a kaleidoscope of color and reflection that made the entire cavern seem to shimmer and dance. The colors were extraordinary: deep amber and pale honey gold, ruby red and burgundy, jade green and emerald, sapphire blue and amethyst violet, each color representing a different preservation, a different food prepared and stored with care against an uncertain future. She moved forward slowly, hardly daring to breathe, and reached out to touch the nearest jar, half afraid it might disappear, that the entire cavern might prove to be some fever dream of her exhausted imagination. But the glass was real and solid and cool beneath her fingers. She read the label, written in the same careful hand she had seen on the journal entries, the ink faded but still legible. Peaches, August 1805. Sugar and spice. Beside it sat another jar, this one containing what looked like apples, the fruit floating in pale amber liquid. Apples, October 1804. Honey and cinnamon? The labels continued, year after year, a careful documentation of harvests and preservation, a record of seasons passing and food being set aside for a future need. She moved deeper into the chamber, her lantern casting its light across row after row of preserved treasures. Berries in their jeweled reds and purples, some that she could identify as blackberries or huckleberries from the mountains, others that she could not place, preserved in sugar and vinegar and spices she could not name. Vegetables lined entire sections, beans in various stages of preservation, some dried and strung together, others suspended in brine or oil, carrots, turnips, onions, all carefully prepared and sealed away. There were jars of what she knew were honey, golden and still liquid despite years of storage. Jars of rendered lard, sealed with cloth and wax to keep out the air. Jars of preserved fish, their silver forms visible through the glass. Jars of something dark and thick that she suspected was molasses. An entire library of survival, carefully curated and maintained, representing the sum total of someone's knowledge about what the human body needed to survive, stored in glass and sealed away from time itself. As she continued deeper into the cavern, she became aware of another layer of storage. Iron hooks had been driven deep into the stone of the cavern, high enough that they would not be disturbed by those walking below, and from these hooks hung the smoked meats. Hams, she could identify those, whole joints of ham wrapped in cloth and hanging in bundles of 3 or 4, dozens of them lining the walls. The ham dark and aged and preserved by smoke and salt. Venison haunches, the meat dark red even from a distance, indicating the care that had been taken in the smoking process. She could see the knife marks in some of them, where recent meals had been taken. There's evidence that these stores had been used and were being actively replenished. Sides of bacon hung in long strips, and what looked like whole joints of beef, dried and preserved with the same meticulous care. The entire wall was lined with hanging meat, a larder that would feed dozens of people for months, or a small family for years. Below the hanging meats, braids of garlic hung from wooden pegs that had been carefully driven into the stone. The bulbs papery and pale, wrinkled slightly with age, but still clearly whole and preserved. Next to the garlic hung braids of onions, some red, some white, some yellow, dozens of braids creating a fragrant cascade that made her nose itch slightly when she stood beneath them. The scent of the preserved alliums was sharp and pungent, and rising up from the bundles in a haze that spoke of their power as preservatives and flavoring agents. She counted more than 50 individual braids, enough to flavor thousands of meals, enough to provide protection against illness and give nourishment to bodies weakened by survival. Above them and to the sides hung bundles of dried herbs, tied with twine and hanging from nails driven deep into the stone. Sage, she could identify that. The gray-green leaves unmistakable even in their dried state. Thyme, the tiny leaves clinging to delicate stems. Yarrow, with its feathery appearance, traditionally used for all manner of ailments. Mint, dried and fragrant. Basil, oregano, rosemary, dozens of varieties. Each bundle labeled with careful script indicating what herb it was and when it had been dried and prepared. The air itself seemed to shimmer with the combined scent of all these preserved herbs, creating an atmosphere that was at once medicinal and nourishing, speaking of knowledge accumulated over generations about what the earth produced and how it could be used to sustain life. Sacks lined the base of the walls, and she moved to examine them, reading the markings with increasing awe. Salt, marked with a simple S, dozens of sacks that must have weighed hundreds of pounds in total. Cornmeal, marked with CM, sealed with care to prevent the infestation of insects or moisture. Flour, marked with F, packed carefully. She could see that each sack had been positioned carefully, organized by type and date, arranged in a system that would allow someone to rotate stock, using the oldest provisions first and replenishing with the newest harvests. There were also wooden barrels, large oak barrels that had been carefully sealed, and she knew without having to ask that they contained water, carefully preserved in this cool cavern where it would not spoil or evaporate. The entire system spoke of knowledge and experience, of someone or some group of people who understood how to preserve food, how to store it, how to keep it from spoiling across months and years of storage in cool, dark places. It spoke of the knowledge that had been accumulated in the mountains for generations, the knowledge of people who lived close to the land and understood that survival depended on careful preparation and the willingness to set aside abundance in seasons of plenty in order to have sustenance in seasons of want. Margaret spent what must have been hours in that cavern, though time seemed to have no meaning in the depths of the mountain. She traced her fingers along the labels of the jars, trying to imagine the hands that had picked the fruit, pressed the berries, gathered the herbs, sliced and prepared and sealed away all of this careful abundance. She thought about the mothers who had done this work, year after year, the knowledge they must have possessed, the commitment to this hidden community that had driven them to spend their time and energy creating this stockpile of survival. She found herself crying, though she could not entirely explain why, tears running down her cheeks as the reality of what she had discovered began to sink deeper into her understanding. This was not just about food. This was about community, about people who had chosen to bind themselves together in secret, people who had decided that certain other people's lives were worth the risk, worth the effort, worth the careful dedication of resources and time and energy. This was about sacrifice in its most fundamental form, sacrifice made in darkness, sacrifice made with no expectation of recognition or reward. Eventually, as the shadows seemed to deepen around her and her lantern burned lower, Margaret knew that she had to return to the main chamber and make her way back out of the cavern system before she was missed for so long that questions became impossible to answer or deflect. She took one more jar from the shelves, selecting it with great care, a jar of preserved peaches that seemed to glow with amber light in her lantern's flame, a jar that was both beautiful and would serve as proof that this place was real, that she had not imagined it all. She wrapped it carefully in cloth from one of the supply crates, securing it so it would not break during the journey back, and she retraced her steps through the passages, carrying her lantern carefully, placing it back in its position in the main cavern, and finally forcing herself back through the narrow gap that led to the tunnel entrance and the waterfall beyond. The sun was setting as she emerged behind the cascade of water, the light turning golden and then orange, painting the sky above the hollow in shades of red and purple and deep blue. She was soaked through, her dress clinging to her skin. Her hair completely escaped from its braid and plastered around her face, her hands and arms streaked with dirt and the marks of stone. She looked like she had been crawling through caves and tunnels for most of the day, which, in fact, she had been. The walk home was difficult, her legs heavy with exhaustion, her mind still spinning with everything she had seen and learned. When she finally emerged from the forest behind her family's property, the stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and lamplight glowed from the windows of the house, indicating that her mother was likely growing worried, or at minimum, irritated at her absence. Margaret took a breath, composed herself as much as she could, and walked toward the house, the wrapped jar of preserved peaches held carefully against her chest, evidence and mystery and proof all wrapped together in cloth and glass. Her mother was indeed waiting on the porch, her face wearing that expression that meant Margaret had some explaining to do. But when she set the jar carefully on the table inside the kitchen, when she unwrapped the cloth to reveal the beautiful amber peaches suspended in their golden syrup, her mother's face changed. The irritation drained away, replaced by something else entirely, something that looked almost like recognition, like pieces of a puzzle were suddenly fitting together in her mind. "Where?" her mother said very carefully, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you find that?" Margaret told her everything, or rather she told her enough, pointing generally toward the ridge and the waterfall and the hidden places in the mountain. She did not tell her about the jars or the meat or the herbs or the journal entries, not yet. Some instinct telling her that those things needed to be protected, that the revelation of this place needed to come more slowly, more carefully, needed to happen in a way that respected the work of all those people who had built it and maintained it across so many years. Her mother sat down heavily in a chair beside the kitchen table, her eyes fixed on the jar of preserved peaches, and for a long moment she said nothing. Then slowly she began to speak. "My mother," she said, her voice carrying the weight of years and secrets and knowledge withheld, "told me about a place like that. She told me it was built by good people, by people who believed that certain other people deserved to be safe, to have shelter and food and sanctuary when the world became cruel. I thought it was just a story, something from the old days before I was born, something that couldn't possibly still exist. But she told me that if it did still exist, if it was still there beneath the mountain, then my children and my children's children would be lucky to live in a place where such goodness persisted, where people still believed in protecting one another, no matter what the world outside demanded." Margaret's mother reached out and touched the jar gently, her fingers trembling slightly. "And now you've found it," she continued, "which means the work is not finished. The sanctuary is still needed. The protection is still being provided. The mountain remembers the people who hid there. The mountain keeps their secrets." She looked up at Margaret, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You will not speak of this to anyone, do you understand? This is not your secret to tell. It belongs to generations of people, people who died keeping it, people who are still living and working to maintain it. You will keep it as your mother has kept her mother's knowledge, and you will pass it on only when you know it is safe to do so, only when you understand fully what it means." Margaret nodded, the weight of the secret settling onto her shoulders, making her feel both very small and somehow much older than she had been that morning when she set out toward the waterfall, driven by nothing more than curiosity and the eternal pull of the mountains calling her toward adventure. The jar of preserved peaches sat on the table between them, glowing in the lamplight, beautiful and mysterious and complete with meaning that Margaret was only beginning to understand. The cavern waited below, she knew, its lanterns still burning, its supplies still carefully maintained, a beacon and a promise and a secret that would shape the rest of her life, that would teach her about sacrifice and community and the lengths to which good people would go to protect the vulnerable and the hunted, the desperate and the driven, the ones who needed sanctuary most.